For decades, their stories went unmentioned in official records. No entries in the archives, no mentions in memorials, as if they had never existed. Then, in 2009, Dutch historian Mika Kerkels tracked down Jefferson Wiggins, the last surviving member of the 965th Company, and convinced him to finally speak. His testimony changed everything. This launched the Black Liberators Project. It led to books, documentaries, and research initiatives. The Dutch people, who had been caring for these graves for 65 years, learned for the first time that the cemetery had been built by Black American soldiers who dug these graves in frozen mud during the winter of 1944. But this story begins much earlier. It begins with a young man from Alabama trying to escape one form of injustice, only to face another on the fields of Europe. In the fall of 1944, it was raining in the Netherlands. Cold, relentless rain that turned the ground to mud and penetrated any clothing. In the small Dutch village of Margraten, located in the southern province of Limburg, just 10 kilometers from Maastricht, an unusual military operation was beginning. Jefferson Wiggins was young. He was only 19 when he arrived in this village as part of the 965th Quartermaster Service Company of the American Army. Born in Alabama to a sharecropper family, he had enlisted in the Army at 16 to escape the Jim Crow laws and the terror of the Ku Klux Klan that ruled the American South. The Army seemed like a path to a better life, to opportunities he would never have had at home. But the United States Army in 1943 was racially segregated. More than 1.2 million African Americans served in World War II, but most were in separate units, received inferior training, lived in worse conditions, and performed secondary duties. White officers commanded black soldiers, but the soldiers themselves couldn't be in the same room with white servicemen when those men were alive. The 961st Quartermaster Service Company was activated in August 1943 at Camp Phillips in Kansas. It consisted of 3 white officers and 276 African American servicemen. Wiggins quickly earned the rank of first sergeant, becoming one of the youngest in that rank in the Army. The company handled equipment and supply transport, dug trenches, and performed other heavy physical labor. In March 1944, they shipped out to Europe. The journey across the Atlantic took 2 weeks aboard the SS Frederick Lykes. About 2,000 soldiers were on the ship. White servicemen were housed on the upper deck, where there were windows, fresh air, and recreation areas. African Americans were below in the hold, without windows. They were allowed to come up on deck for air, but the entertainment facilities and rest areas were for whites only. They landed in Glasgow, Scotland, and spent several months working at a depot, assembling supplies for the Normandy invasion. They didn't participate in the D-Day landing on June 6th, but later crossed the English Channel to support the advancing forces. The company followed behind the front lines, transporting ammunition and food from France to Belgium and then to the Netherlands, sometimes under enemy fire, clearing roads and maintaining the logistics of war. By the end of October 1944, the southern part of the Netherlands had been liberated. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division liberated Margraten on September 13th. But liberation came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of American soldiers had died in the battles to free this land, and their bodies needed to be buried somewhere. American command selected a site near the village of Margraten for a military cemetery. It had once been an orchard. Now it would become the final resting place for thousands of young Americans who fell fighting against Nazism. Road construction to the future cemetery began in late October. Then the 611th Graves Registration Company arrived under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Schoeman to organize the cemetery. And for the heaviest work, soldiers from the 965th Quartermaster Service Company were called in. On November 10, 1944, on the eve of Thanksgiving, the first 300 American soldiers were buried. Work began that would continue for 3 months without a single day off. Jefferson Wiggins and his men received no special training for this task. They were simply handed a pickaxe and shovel and told to dig 3 graves per day per person. A standard grave had to be 6 feet deep, 6 feet long, and 2.5 feet wide. The work was exhausting. October turned to November, November to December. The rains grew colder, sometimes turning to snow. The ground became harder, freezing on particularly cold nights. Water filled freshly dug graves before bodies could be placed in them. Trucks and equipment got stuck in the mud, often losing the ability to move across the sodden ground. Every day, army trucks arrived loaded with bodies. Soldiers from the 965th Company unloaded them and carried them to burial sites. After processing, a body would be placed in a canvas bag with dog tags in the mouth and lowered into the grave. Wiggins later recalled that many bodies were frozen. Some were mutilated beyond recognition. The work wasn't just physically demanding, it was psychologically devastating. Soldiers under his command wept as they dug graves. They were completely traumatized. During the day, no one spoke, working in silence, each alone with their thoughts and the horror of what they were seeing. There was a cruel irony to this work. These black soldiers couldn't sit in the same room with white servicemen while those men were alive, but now they had to bury them with dignity. They couldn't eat at the same table with them, couldn't sleep in the same barracks, but now they held their frozen bodies in their arms and lowered them into the ground. And yet they worked with respect. When possible, they conducted improvised services, reading prayers and singing hymns they remembered from home. Wiggins told his men that when they lowered someone into a grave, they became the last person that the dead person had contact with. This placed a special responsibility on them. As winter deepened, the death toll increased. The Battle of the Bulge was happening nearby, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The German counteroffensive in December 1944 resulted in huge losses among American troops. Every day, hundreds of bodies were brought to Margraten. Sometimes as many as 500 bodies arrived in a single day. The 961st Company worked 12-hour shifts, digging, burying, digging again. Over 3 months of continuous work, they dug more than 20,000 graves. More than 20,000 young American lives, cut short in a foreign land, found their final resting place thanks to the labor of these African American soldiers. The local population of Margraten witnessed this work. Villagers watched as trucks with bodies arrived every day, as black soldiers labored in the mud and cold. When the death toll became particularly high, the American military asked the villagers for help, and the people of Margraten responded, helping to dig graves, creating a connection between the Dutch province and the American cemetery that would endure for decades to come. Spring 1945 brought relief in the sense that the ground became softer and the work physically easier. But the death toll continued to rise as the Allies advanced deeper into Nazi Germany. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the battles for the Ruhr region, the continuing advance, all brought more and more bodies. By the time the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, approximately 18,000 American servicemen were buried at the Margraten Cemetery. Among them were not only Americans, but also temporarily buried soldiers from other Allied nations, and even German prisoners of war, who were buried in a separate section. In March 1945, Captain Showman officially commended the 965th Company for their heroic efforts. But the story didn't end there. Wiggins and his company completed their task and were transferred to other duties. Then they returned home to America. For Wiggins, the return was bitter. He had fought for freedom in Europe, but came back to a country where Jim Crow laws still operated, where segregation was the norm, where he, as a black man, was denied basic rights. But Wiggins decided not to give up. During his service in Europe, he had received a battlefield promotion to first lieutenant from General George Patton himself. He used the benefits provided to veterans under the GI Bill to get an education. He earned several academic degrees, including a doctorate, and became a teacher, community leader, writer, and mentor in the northeastern states. In the mid-1990s, he settled in New Fairfield, Connecticut, where together with his wife Janice, he won numerous awards as a community figure. He was a popular and sought-after speaker, a man with a kind character and a reputation as a bridge builder between people. But for decades, he told no one about his experience in Margraten. It was a secret he kept deep inside, a trauma he couldn't talk about. In the Netherlands, the Margraten Cemetery had become something unique. In 1945, when the war ended, one of the village officials proposed an idea that seemed simple but became incredibly powerful. He suggested that families and individual citizens adopt the graves of American soldiers. The idea was that each grave would have a Dutch family or person who would commit to caring for it, bringing flowers, maintaining the memory of the fallen soldier. This wasn't an official government project, it was a grassroots movement, an expression of the Dutch people's deep gratitude to those who died for their freedom. The first Memorial Day in 1945 saw every grave decorated with flowers. By 1946, when the cemetery held an incredible 18,764 graves, all of them had been adopted. Every single one. In subsequent years, much changed. In 1947 to 1948, about 10,000 American soldiers were repatriated to the United States at the request of their families, who wanted to bury their loved ones at home. Russian soldiers were reburied at a Russian military cemetery in Amersfoort, German dead at a German military cemetery in Eiselstein. The cemetery received its permanent status as an American military cemetery in 1947. The remaining American soldiers were reburied in permanent locations, and the work was completed by 1949. On July 7, 1960, the cemetery was officially dedicated in the form we know today. A tall memorial tower with a chapel inside, walls of the missing with the names of 1,722 servicemen whose bodies were never found, and 8,288 white headstones arranged in neat rows. The adoption program continued. Dutch families passed responsibility for graves from generation to generation. Some families have been caring for the same grave since 1945. They come several times a year, bring flowers, study the history of the soldier whose grave they've adopted. Many have contacted relatives in the United States, built relationships, sometimes meeting them at the grave in Margraten. By 2021, there was even a waiting list of people wanting to adopt a grave. But no one talked about who built this cemetery. No one mentioned the African American soldiers who dug these 20,000 graves in the mud and snow. There was no information about them in the archives. Their story was buried along with the bodies they placed in the ground. In 2009, Dutch writer and historian Mieke Kerkels began an oral history project about the Margraten Cemetery. She interviewed local residents, studied documents, trying to reconstruct the complete picture of how the cemetery was created. It was from local residents that she first heard about the black soldiers who dug the graves. Old-timers remembered seeing them at work, but there were no official records. Kerkels began a search, trying to find at least one surviving member of the 965th Quartermaster Service Company. The search led her to Jefferson Wiggins, who was living in Connecticut. By that time, he was 84 years old. He was the last living member of the 965th Company who had worked at Margraten. Kerkels contacted him and asked him to tell his story. At first, Wiggins hesitated. For 65 years, he had been silent about this experience. But Kerkels was persistent, and eventually he agreed. For the first time, he began to talk about what he had seen and experienced during those cold months of 1944 to 1945. The interviews became the basis for Kerkels' book, From Alabama to Margraten, The Memories of Gravedigger Jefferson Wiggins. Wiggins also appeared on Dutch television, giving interviews and telling his story. His wife Janice learned the details of what her husband had endured for the first time. In 2009, Wiggins returned to Margraten for the first time since 1945. This was for the 65th anniversary celebration of the liberation of the Netherlands. An international gathering honoring the cemetery invited him to speak at a public celebration in Maastricht. Cemetery Superintendent Mike Yazinchak presented Wiggins with an American flag in recognition of his role in burying thousands of American servicemen. It was a moment of recognition that came 65 years later than it should have. In his speech, Wiggins said something important. He was asked what he wanted people to know about Margraten. He replied, "I don't care that they know what I did. I care that they know what American soldiers did." In 2007, the 961st Quartermaster Service Company was awarded a commendation for meritorious service. In 2009, as a guest of the Dutch government, Wiggins delivered the keynote address at the 65th anniversary celebration of the liberation of the Netherlands, where he was honored as the last surviving soldier who buried the dead at Margraten. That same year, he received an honorary doctorate. He wrote 2 books about his experience serving in the segregated army. He became a voice not only for himself, but for all the men of the 965th Company whose stories had been forgotten. Many of them returned home and faced the same racial barriers they had fled. Many became participants in the civil rights movement. The U.S. Army was officially desegregated only in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, by order of President Harry Truman. Kerkels continued her research, expanding it into the Black Liberators in the Netherlands project. The project's goal was to document the contribution of African American servicemen to the liberation of the Netherlands. Researchers began studying the lives of the 172 African American soldiers buried at Margraten among their 8,000 white comrades in arms. The Faces of Margraten project began collecting photographs of every buried soldier. Every 2 years, in early May, when the Netherlands commemorates its own Memorial Day, volunteers come to the cemetery and decorate the graves and names on the walls of the missing with personal photographs of the soldiers, giving faces to their names. By 2020, 7,500 photographs had been collected. Jefferson Wiggins died in 2013, shortly before Kerkel's complete book was published. He was 87 years old. His wife Janice continued his work preserving the memory of the 961st Company. In September 2024, nearly 80 years after the cemetery's creation, 2 information panels were installed in the new Visitors Center. One told the general story of African American servicemen in World War II who waged a double struggle, for victory abroad and for civil rights at home. The other told the story of technician 4th grade George Pruitt from New Jersey, who died in June 1945 trying to save a comrade who had fallen into a river in Germany. The panels were installed partly thanks to the efforts of then U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, Shefali Razdan Dugal, and Janice Wiggins herself, who lobbied for the inclusion of mention of African American soldiers' contributions in the Visitors Center exhibit. Janice was emphatic. These panels were never intended to be a temporary exhibit or rotation. They were meant to be a permanent part of the Visitors Center display. In the summer of 2025, cemetery visitors began noticing that the panels had disappeared. Dutch media raised the issue. Local politicians began asking questions. What happened to the panels that told the story of African American soldiers? The American Battle Monuments Commission, which manages the cemetery, gave a vague explanation. One panel, they said, was removed from display as part of an exhibit rotation. The other was deaccessioned after an internal content review. Janice Wiggins was shocked to learn about the removal of the panels. She said she experienced a sickening feeling, not just reading about it, but actually experiencing how history and those who made it could be so easily and carelessly erased. It was very personal for her. Eisden Margraten Mayor Elaine Kreinen wrote a letter to the commission asking them to reconsider the decision to remove the exhibits. Dutch politicians in Limburg province called the removal indecent and unacceptable, stating it does not do justice to history. 11 of the 15 parties in the Limburg Provincial Council supported the idea of a permanent memorial to the Black liberators. The Dutch people, liberated by these soldiers, wanted to remember who liberated them. but the American government removed the names. Researchers and activists pointed to the context. The removal occurred during a period when President Trump's administration was conducting a campaign against diversity and inclusion programs. In March 2025, Arlington Cemetery removed references to the history of African American and women service members from its website. There were reports that the conservative think tank Heritage Foundation had filed a complaint about the panels at Margraten. This is the same organization that developed Project 2025, a policy blueprint for a conservative administration. Some commission representatives mentioned that the decision was made after a review conducted by former Commission Secretary Charles Jew, who was appointed under President Biden. Jew wrote that the removal was done in accordance with Trump administration directives. The picture was confusing, full of conflicting statements. But the fact remained: the panels were removed, and now there was no text information in the Visitors Center about the contribution of African American soldiers to building the cemetery. The story of the panel removal at Margraten is more than just a museum exhibit controversy. It's a story about whose memory is considered worthy of preservation. It's a story about how easily the contributions of those who don't fit the preferred narrative can be erased. African American soldiers in World War II fought two wars simultaneously. They fought against fascism and Nazism abroad, and they fought against racism and segregation at home. More than 1.2 million African Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces during the war. Most were assigned to service units rather than combat units, but their service was no less important, no less worthy of recognition. The 961st Quartermaster Service Company didn't participate in direct combat. They didn't storm the beaches of Normandy, didn't fight in the Bulge, didn't participate in airborne drops as part of Operation Market Garden. But they faced the horrors of war in the most direct and intimate way. They held in their hands the bodies of those who fought and died. They dug thousands of graves with their own hands, in the cold and mud, month after month. They did this with dignity and respect, even when they themselves were denied dignity and respect while these soldiers were alive. They couldn't sit in the same room with white soldiers, couldn't eat at the same table, couldn't live in the same barracks. But they could bury them. They were good enough to dig graves, but not good enough to be equals. Wiggins himself described this cruel irony. But he also spoke about the sense of responsibility they felt. When you lower someone into their grave, you become the last person the dead has contact with. This is a sacred duty, regardless of skin color. The story of the 961st Company is part of a broader history of the African American military experience. From the Revolutionary War to today, African Americans have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, often under conditions of discrimination and inequality. During the Civil War, more than 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, fighting for the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the Union. After the war, they faced the Jim Crow era and systematic denial of civil rights. In World War I, more than 360,000 African Americans served in segregated units. Some, like the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, earned high honors from the French government for bravery in combat. But at home, they returned to the same segregation and discrimination. World War II saw the largest participation of African Americans in the armed forces up to that time. More than 1.2 million served, and their experience became a catalyst for the post-war civil rights movement. If they could fight and die for democracy abroad, why couldn't they have full rights at home? Famous units like the Tuskegee Airmen received wide recognition for their achievements, but there were thousands of others whose stories remained unknown. Soldiers like those from the 965th Company, who performed vital but thankless work. Truck drivers, loaders, builders, grave diggers, all those who kept the military machine functioning, but whose stories didn't make it into history textbooks. 172 African American soldiers are buried at Margraten. Some were awarded the highest honors. Private Willie James Jr. received the Medal of Honor, the highest U.S. military award, but only 52 years after his heroic act. He saved his platoon, but racial discrimination meant his award was delayed for decades. These soldiers fought on the front lines when segregation laws were blurred out of necessity. They proved their courage and dedication again and again, but their contribution was systematically ignored or downplayed. The contrast between American and Dutch attitudes toward the memory of these soldiers is striking. While American authorities remove the panels telling about African American soldiers, the Dutch people are demanding their return. Local and provincial authorities in Limburg expressed serious concern about the panel removal. They stated that the panels depicted a history we should never forget and from which we can learn much, especially now when global divisions are increasingly intensifying. The mayor met with the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands to discuss the issue. Provincial politicians are discussing creating a temporary memorial to Black American liberators outside cemetery grounds if American authorities don't return the panels. For the Dutch, this story has special significance. They live with the memory of 4 years of Nazi occupation, of the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, of deportations and death. They know the price of freedom because they lost it and got it back thanks to the sacrifices of others. The grave adoption program isn't just a tradition, it's an expression of deep gratitude. Each adopted grave represents a personal connection between a Dutch family and an American soldier. They study his history, learn about his life, sometimes contact his family in America. They don't let these soldiers be forgotten. And when they learned that the cemetery was built by African American soldiers who dug 20,000 graves in mud and snow, they wanted to honor that memory too. Because for them, it doesn't matter what color skin those who liberated them had. What matters is that they came, fought, and many died for the freedom of the Netherlands. The panel removal at Margraten didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a broader discussion in the United States about how we remember history, whose history we tell, and whose contributions we acknowledge. In recent years, there have been intense debates about Confederate monuments. Many were erected not immediately after the Civil War, but decades later, during the Jim Crow era and during the Civil Rights Movement, as symbols of white supremacy and intimidation of African American communities. Some of these monuments have been removed, sparking debates about erasing history. But defenders of removal point out that these monuments aren't neutral historical artifacts. They were erected with a specific political purpose: to glorify the Confederate cause and perpetuate racial hierarchy. At the same time, work is being done to expand our understanding of history, to include voices and stories that have been marginalized or forgotten. Museums are adding context to their exhibits. Historical sites are including information about enslaved people who lived and worked there. Textbooks are being rewritten to give a more complete picture of American history. But there's also a counter-movement, resistance to what some call rewriting history or cancel culture. Debates about critical race theory, about how to teach the history of slavery and racism in schools, have become deeply politicized. The panel removal at Margraten can be seen as part of this broader struggle. On one side are those who believe that acknowledging racial injustice of the past is divisive or inappropriate. On the other are those who believe that honestly confronting history, even when it's painful, is necessary for genuine national memory and reconciliation. When the panels were removed from the Visitors Center at Margraten, what exactly was lost? On a practical level, cemetery visitors no longer receive information about who built the cemetery. They see thousands of white headstones, read about the battles in which these soldiers died, learn about the grave adoption program. But they don't learn about the young African American soldiers who dug these graves, who wept as they lowered bodies into the ground, who worked 3 months without a day off in the harshest winter. They don't learn about the double struggle these soldiers waged, fighting for democracy abroad while asserting their own rights at home. They don't learn about Jefferson Wiggins, who escaped Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama only to face segregation in the Army, but who nevertheless served with honor and dignity. They don't learn about George Pruitt, who drowned in a river trying to save a comrade. They don't learn about Willie James Jr., who saved his platoon and waited 52 years for his award. They don't learn about the 172 African American soldiers buried at Margraten, whose stories deserve to be told just as much as those of their white comrades in arms. On a deeper level, what was lost is the opportunity for a full and honest historical narrative. The story of World War II in the United States is often told as a story of unity and common purpose, the greatest generation that defeated fascism. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the fact that the American Army was racially segregated, that African American soldiers served in separate units, often performed the hardest and dirtiest work, and still faced discrimination and inequality. That they fought for a country that denied them full citizenship rights. And the whole truth also includes the fact that they served with honor, that they made vital contributions to the war effort, that their experience helped lay the foundation for the civil rights movement that transformed America in the post-war decades. To remove this part of the story is to present a simplified, sanitized vision of the past. It means preserving a comfortable myth instead of complex reality. Today, the Margraten Cemetery remains a place of quiet reflection and deep memory. Dutch families continue to care for adopted graves. Every 2 years, the Faces of Margraten project decorates graves with soldiers' photographs. Annual memorial ceremonies draw thousands of people. The debate about the panels continues. The U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands has met with local officials. Dutch politicians continue to press for permanent recognition of African American soldiers' contributions. Perhaps the panels will be returned. Perhaps an alternative memorial will be created. But the more important question remains: how do we remember? Whose stories do we tell? Whose sacrifices do we acknowledge? Jefferson Wiggins understood this. When asked what he wanted people to know, he didn't talk about himself. He talked about all American soldiers who served. He talked about the importance of remembering not only the glorious moments of victory, but the difficult, dirty, traumatizing work that made that victory possible. He spent much of his life trying to give voice to those who couldn't speak, people from humble beginnings who did their duty and thereby made significant contributions to history. He wanted their stories told, no more but no less recognition than the white soldiers they served with deserved. The story of the 965th Quartermaster Service Company is a reminder that the history of war doesn't consist only of battles and generals. It also consists of the people who provide logistics, who bury the dead, who perform 1,000 necessary tasks that don't make headlines, but without which war cannot be waged. It's also a reminder of how easily the contributions of those on the margins of society can be forgotten or ignored. It took 65 years for the story of the 965th Company to become known. It took the efforts of a Dutch researcher, the willingness of the last surviving member of the company to finally speak, and the persistence of a widow for this story to be recognized. And even after it was recognized, even after panels were installed to tell this story, they were removed. The story was again in danger of being forgotten. But the Dutch people don't want to forget. They remember what occupation meant. They remember what liberation meant. And they want to honor everyone who made that liberation possible. Not only those who fought on the front lines, but those who dug graves in the cold and mud. Maybe that's the lesson we can all take from Margraten. Memory is an active choice. We choose what to remember and how to remember it. We can choose comfortable stories that make us feel good, or we can choose complete stories that include complexity, contradictions, and injustice. The 20,000 graves at Margraten were dug by the hands of young African American soldiers who couldn't sit in the same room with those they buried. That's an uncomfortable truth. But it's a truth we must remember if we want to truly honor the sacrifices of all who served. Jefferson Wiggins said that when you lower someone into their grave, you become the last person the dead has contact with. It's a heavy responsibility, but also an honor. The men of the 960th Quartermaster Service Company fulfilled this duty with dignity and respect. Now it's our turn to honor their memory with the same dignity and respect, not to forget their stories, not to erase their contributions, but to tell the complete story, the whole truth about who fought, who served, and who sacrificed so that we could live free. In the Dutch village of Margraten, 8,288 white headstones stand in rows on green grass. Each represents a story, a life given in sacrifice. And behind each grave stands another story, the story of those who dug that grave, who lowered the body into the ground, who gave final honors. These stories also deserve to be told. They too are part of our shared history. And only by telling all the stories, all the truths, can we truly understand the price of freedom and the meaning of sacrifice.